When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. John Muir from My First Summer in the Sierra, the great American naturalist who wrote that in 1911. And I believe it every day in my work. I'd like to talk tonight about the extended holobiont and what that actually means. It's a bit of a mashing up of terminology. I don't have any formal academic training, I just read a lot. I'm a chef, and I have been for some 20 years. But I always loved the sciences, even though I was pretty bad at school. But after leaving high school and working in kitchens, I just still craved knowledge. So I would read in my off time, or read, on staff meal break. And a lot of that was centered around biology and trying to understand, nature. I think I must have been maybe like 24, 25 when I read Richard Dawkins' The Extended Phenotype, which is a book about the way organisms spill out into their environments and how genes that sit within bodies can affect a lot more than those bodies themselves. He uses this archetypal example of a beaver. If you look at the actual genes that a beaver has within itself, within its cells, that program only for proteins, really. Sometimes regulator genes, sometimes muscle proteins. But really all genes do is communicate to ribosomes how to stitch together protein. And what those proteins do after that can affect a lot more than just the construction of a cell or the construction of a muscle fiber or tissue. And in this book, Richard Dawkins argues that the genes for a beaver also programs for a beaver dam. There are behavioral genes that affect what a beaver reacts to in its environment, how its brain operates, what stimuli it seeks out, and how it operates, and that directly has an impact on the fitness of an organism. There's this, I really should have included it because I'm only thinking about it now, but there's this really funny video on YouTube of this beaver rescue, and it's like a baby beaver, and it had to be taken into the home of the rangers, wherever this national park was. And this beaver had to beaver. And it starts destroying the house and building a dam out of furniture, out of whatever piece, chairs, cardboard boxes, and the rangers taping this little baby beaver. And it's a perfect example of the extended phenotype. So it's exactly why Richard Dawkins reached for it in his book. A genotype is everything that is expressed in a genome. So let's take me and my baby, for example. My father is Ashkenazi Jewish. He was born with blue eyes. My mother is Caribbean. She was born with brown eyes. I was born with brown eyes because that's the dominant allele, even though I still carry those blue-eyed genes within me. That is not I don't have the expressed phenotype for blue eyes. The phenotype is what becomes expressed, even though I have the genes for blue eyes within me. I have a baby, though, and I pass on that recessive gene for blue eyes. I have a Swedish girlfriend, and she produces a blue-eyed baby boy for me. So his phenotype is that of blue eyes, even though he also carries those alleles within him too. So you can see how this kind of this is Mendelian genetics, how sometimes traits can be carried, but what becomes expressed can differ depending on other conditions, parental lineages. Same thing is true of an extended phenotype. Sometimes, depending on what's going on in the environment, you can have very different outcomes. So here is a great example, I'm still talking about beavers, of their impact on their extended environment. You can see before beaver colonization, a river that has some vegetation around it, and this is from a study on how beavers affect their environment and make them more climate resilient. And below, you see the marshland that's been created and how, much further beyond the borders of the actual river banks, now that there is a wetland growing, you have a lot more drought-resistant crops, which are changing the nature of the landscape and making overall the entire environment more resilient to climate change. That's just to prime you on the idea of the extended phenotype, right? There's something within beavers that drives them to build dams, to create a habitat that extends well beyond their bodies. It's not just about I don't know if there's blue-eyed beavers, but it's not just about the color of their fur or the shape of their tail. It's about what they do to their environment. It might not be initially apparent, but the trees in their environment are organisms as well. I'd like to talk a little bit about a trip I took with Veronica last year, about a year ago exactly right now, to Nova Bulgaria, where I was hired as a photographer, so you're going to look at my photos. But I was happy to pontificate and help out with, microbiological research and help with test tubes and plating while we were there in this tiny village with our collaborator Sevgi Mutlu, who was born in this tiny village, a Turkish village in southern Bulgaria, but moved away when she was quite young. We'd returned to visit her extended family, her great uncle and great aunt, and stay with them. And they had a cow, not this cow, but they had a cow in their backyard. And this cow provided them with all the milk they needed for their family. Their son was living with them as well. Their daughter would come and hang out with them for dinner as well. So, this is like a family of 3.5 people and a grandson who was popping in and out, who were living off of, a large part of their diet, the milk of this animal, of this domesticate. Twice a day, this cow would be milked. And depending on kind of the flow of the pantry and the meal plan, Mushrem, the grandmother, would often make yogurt on kind of a regular basis, maybe every day or every other day. The cows would graze in the hillsides. They would feast on the grass. They'd be let out of their gates, kind of like a lot of houses in this village had like a single cow or maybe 2 cows kind of in a barn in the backyard or very nearby. And so the kind of village's cows would wander the streets alongside the cars that would drive to local factories where people were going to work. This is a village of around like 1,000, 2,000 people. And it felt like they were just a part of the community, grazing the landscape on this mountainous terrain that couldn't be really used all too well for agriculture. And they would come home and bring that landscape back with them. Here's a video of Mehmet, Sevgi's great uncle, milking the cows. Veronica went to actually study the microbiology of this whole system, of these traditional ferments, and to swab the teats of the animals, to swab the poop that was in the bards, to swab Mehmet's hands, to culture the milk, and see where a lot of the microorganisms in some of these yogurt recipes were coming from. And a big part of this was understanding just the traditional yogurt itself, the thing that was made, by taking that fresh milk, unpasteurized and raw, heating it up in a pot until it bit your pinky finger, probably around 60 or 70 degrees, and then allowing it to sit by the hearth overnight until it fermented around 40 degrees at, just the temperature of the warm air flowing off the heater. Until it turned into the most delicious yogurt I've ever tasted the following morning. But Sevgi's angle, who is a researcher at the Rachel Carson Institute, was more of an ethnographic one. She was interested in some of the culinary traditions of the region that had been lost to time with increasing industrialization. And while there were a few examples and more that I'll get into, more than I have time to get into tonight, things like harvesting rainwater that were centered around, the equinox traditions, using the roots of nettles. The one that I thought was most fascinating was the use of ants and anthills as modes of inoculum and incubators for the creation of yogurt. Now, this would be done traditionally when herders would go out for days at a time. This is back when there would be almost as many cows in a village as there were people, and they would be able to, graze on the terrain of green fields and pasture much further than that of the immediate village, because otherwise the grass would be raised to the ground. So this was Mehmet's old job specifically. I think he worked primarily with sheep, but also with cattle, and they would go out for days at a time before coming back with the village's herd. They would be paid their share for taking care of these animals. But when you're out in the field, you don't have access to your normal hearth, and you don't have access to the backslop of the yogurt culture that you would have to use to keep culturing these things on a regular basis, like his wife did at home. So what Sevgi discovered in like ancient texts going back, over 100 years from basically anthropologists in Turkey, and other rumors that stretch throughout the Balkans all the way up to, as one friend told me when he learned that I was on this trip, like Kosovo. There are a lot of rumors about this foreign tradition, about this former tradition, where ants, a couple or their larvae, would be dropped into the milk, fresh from the cow that you had on hand, put into a container, and then you would go and find that anthill and bury it within the center of the colony. These are wood ants, Formica, that you see here, that harvest pine cones to build their mounds. We recreated these recipes with greater and lesser success in certain instances. And it was still pretty chilly at this time of the year, but we did manage to make these loose curds, the beginnings of this ant yogurt. And I immediately realized, I'm like, well, Veronica, it was pretty chilly out last night. I don't think that's enough. Like, even if we have those microbes in there, and even if when you take these samples back to Copenhagen and sequence them, you find fermentative bacteria, it's still pretty chilly. And she's like, yeah, you're right. We can't see it as a total failure. We'll have to look at all the kind of extraneous circumstances. But I thought to myself, knowing I used to make hundreds of liters a week of yogurt at Noma, and I knew that we wouldn't even be able to achieve curds this loose if there wasn't something going on. And then Veronica told me a story about this famous Finnish myrmecologist. Was he from Finland? Or the photo is in Finland?
Depends on which myrmecologist.
Okay, fair enough. But you told me about this very famous photo that I wish I had.
Yeah.
Of a myrmecologist in the dead of winter standing in a sea of white next to an anthill that was just like a black hole of contrast. And you said, well, actually, David, the anthills themselves must serve as an incubator because they produce their own body heat. They are, in many ways, a compost pile. The ants go and forage the landscape, all the things that the cows aren't eating, beyond grass, the bugs in the environment, scraps of fruit, and whatever else they might find delectable. And they bring it back to their mound and concentrate it. And while they feed on it themselves and feed it to their larvae and feed it to their all the workers that stay within the actual mound, there are microbes in there that partake on that feast as well. And there are very specific strains of fungi and bacteria that are endemic to these mounds that produce an exothermic metabolism that is greater than the actual, individual insects themselves. And in that same example of that, field of white and snow, you have this idea that with the help of microbes that go beyond just the bodies of these organisms, like where does the self of an ant colony really exist? Within the minds of the individual ants? There's this famous Spanish proverb about another hymenopteran insect, bees. A single bee is not a bee. That's absolutely true. Ants are often considered superorganisms. So if you have this disembodied organism that's made not of cells but of actual individuals, and you have their home that is this kind of amorphous, boundaryless spreading out of pine needles that can be broken and opened and moved and kicked, but rebuilt, and you have microbes that live in that body, and they have a metabolism of their own, then you see this kind of extension of the idea of the holobiont into its environment. And this gets even more complicated in a little bit. But the metabolism of the anthill itself, which is a weird thing to say, is what actually allowed us enough of a kind of like thermal boost to get these enzymes that would have been produced by whatever microbes were thriving in there to actually curdle the milk. Because otherwise they would have been dormant, and they wouldn't have had the actual energetic minimum to get over the hill to coagulate some of these proteins. Then Veronica blew my mind again. While we were out on this expedition, being a chef who used to work at Noma, I was tasting everything. I would be like, oh, there's a fun mushroom, and like, oh, that's wild ramsons. It tastes different here. And when we finally came across the first anthill that Mehmet had showed us, I immediately ate an ant, as I am often wont to do, because I wanted to know what they taste like. They're usually citrusy. We had them on the menu at Noma all the time, and Veronica said, "Don't do that." And I said, "Why? This is not my first rodeo." And she said, "You could get sick." And I'm like, "From what? I've eaten these hundreds of times before." And she's like, "There's liver flukes out here." And I'm like, "What?" And then she told me about a common parasite that I'd never heard of before. Semi-common, kind of rare. Maybe human infections are rare, but they're out there. This is, I just memorized the name, Dercocolium dendriticum. Round of applause for me. It has a fascinating life cycle that almost mimics this symbiotic relationship that you find with our investigations into ant yogurt. So with ant yogurt, we had this cycle of animals going into the hills, feasting on grass, coming back to their herder, the herder that would then milk them, that would use ants from the environment to inoculate them with bacteria, and then use the anthill, which was itself a concentration of the metabolic potential energy in the environment that would be, the thermal incubator, if you will, to actually ferment that milk into yogurt that then the herder would consume himself to give himself energy to continue this cycle ever forward. You see that loop there. That is an interaction between microbes and macrobes and the landscape itself. But then she told me there's like this evil twin of this scenario, of this loop. That was the liver fluke's life cycle. A liver fluke is a parasite that has a very complicated life cycle. I don't even know where to start. There's a number 1 there. Okay, we'll start with cow poop, and we'll come back to cow poop. So there's cow poop in the environment. The cows, we'll get to how see, now I'm going backwards. There's cow poop in the environment, and snails in the environment eat the cow poop. They eat the dung. And the eggs of this liver fluke, which is a trematode, a very, very tiny, almost microscopic, it is a microbe in its larval stage, organism, then infects the snail. The snail doesn't get too affected by it. It just sequesters it in a little cyst and then poops it out itself. But it poops it out while it's sliding along in its slime. Ants drink snail slime as a source of moisture. The ants come along, they sip on the snail slime, and then they get infected with the larvae in huge quantities because they're all sequestered in these little cysts that then go on to take over these ants' brains. You've heard of, thank you, Last of Us, you've heard of zombie fungus, but there's zombie flukes too. And they literally change the ants' behavior and get them to run up on blades of grass and clamp down and just sit there, just like cordyceps do. But they don't release spores. They wait until a grazing animal, like a cow, comes along and consumes the ant along with the grass. That's where it has its reproductive stage, where it climbs, once it's inside a mammal, it will kind of climb back up the esophagus and then enter the bile duct of the organism. And that's where it will fester and reproduce. It doesn't actually affect, or it's kind of asymptomatic in a lot of mammals. You have to get a pretty bad case to become very sick from it, which can result in like bile duct inflammation or liver inflammation. But it'll eventually reproduce in such quantity that it then passes through your digestive system and then comes out your poop, and the cycle begins anew. Don't ask me why they settled on this life cycle. They did. It's not glamorous, but it works for them. But nonetheless, these are incredible adaptations that the actual microorganism, in its adult form, it's like 1.5 millimeters wide by like 5 millimeters. So it becomes a macrobe eventually, but in its larval stage, it's tiny. You need a microscope to see it. You have these wild adaptations that are deeply interconnected into its hosts. Parasites are symbionts. We can't forget that. The delineation between whether something is helpful or harmful is a sliding scale, and sometimes something that is parasitic can be beneficial in a different circumstance. But here, to some of the organisms in this web, you see definite detriment, especially to the ants that then get consumed by a cow. But it's this incredible example of this wheel of life that keeps spinning, where the extension of the microorganism's life cycle isn't just a beaver dam, it isn't detritus in the environment, it is literally other organisms in multiple stages of life. And you could say that the extension of this holobiont isn't just one organism, but several. And it affects everything from immune responses in the mammals and the snails to behaviors in the ants themselves. And I would argue that in fermentation, we see that same sort of cycle that affects not just immune responses, if you want to talk about the old friends hypothesis, where our own immune systems have evolved to live alongside the microbes that have issued, in some cases, like immunosuppressant molecules to kind of temper our immune system, but they also influence our behaviors. If yogurt is so delicious that we have domesticated cows and build entire cultures around its cultivation and its production, and it becomes the entire center point of a nation's pride culinarily around the dinner table and breakfast table, then doesn't that affect our behaviors too? Aren't the bacteria doing something special to our brains to convince us that whatever they can do in the foods that we present to them is so delicious that we should keep doing it? I would say that the attunement that we have to heavily fermented products like soy sauce and miso from species like Aspergillus or sometimes Bacillus is a perfect example of that. Our penchant for alcohol, the adaptation to alcohol dehydrogenase, that gene that morphed some 10 million years ago in our primate ancestor that allowed us to not just be poisoned by alcohol and partition niches with our monkey kin, come down from trees and start exploring the forest floor, but actually get drunk and become highly social animals because of our love of fermented fruit. I would say that the line becomes very blurry in that the holobiont no longer can be viewed as the large organism hosting small ones, but it's also the small ones affecting the environment around them that includes large ones. I always say in my work in fermentation that organisms can always be considered environments to each other. Everything in fermentation is an example of that. Whenever you ferment food, you're growing life inside other forms of life, sometimes living, sometimes dead, sometimes with the potential to kind of operate between the two. And I think that this trip to Bulgaria and my work with Veronica and Sevgi is a perfect example of the way genomes and phenotypes bleed out into their surroundings and literally affect the bodies and minds of other organisms to change the way they operate and to change the way they move through the world. Here was the successful batch, our last Slavo of the ant yogurt, and that's Veronica's hand modeling that over the village itself. And to kind of lay this point home, I'd just like to finish off with another quote, a bookend, if you will, from Octavia Butler, the renowned science fiction author. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. Thank you.